Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion today. I'm Jean McElvain, the Interim Director and Associate Curator at the Goldstein Museum of Design, which is part of the College of Design here at the University of Minnesota. We're delighted to have all of you here, and before beginning, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. I also just wanted to take a moment to say that all of our programming is made possible in part by the voters of Minnesota through a Minnesota State Arts Board Operation Support Grant, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. We're also funded, of course, by generous donors in the College of Design. So a quick note about today's setup. This meeting is set in focused mode. This means that you will only be able to see the video and screens of the co-hosts here, and you will not be able to see the videos of other participants. Live transcription has been enabled, so please feel free to use that if you need to. And changing your screen view to speaker view will also improve the interface. This discussion will be recorded and available to view on the Goldstein's YouTube channel later in the month. And should you have questions for today's speakers, feel free to enter those in the chat. So before beginning, I am going to introduce my colleagues here. Our moderator today is Dr. Caren S. Oberg, and Caren earned her PhD at the College of Design at the University of Minnesota and holds a Master's of Arts and Teaching degree in museum education. She's an independent scholar whose research considers the interactions of materiality, meaning, and memory within the context of museums as cultural institutions. I'd also like to introduce the co-curator of this exhibition and my co-presenter, Colleen Pokorny, who is currently a PhD student in apparel studies with a minor in museum studies at the University of Minnesota. She also holds a master's degree in apparel studies from Minnesota. Colleen is the Dora A.G. Waller Collection Assistant at the Goldstein Museum, and her research interests include the intersection of quilt making and upcycled fashion, quilt making innovations, and 3D body scanning anthropometry.
So for the next 20 minutes or so, as Colleen said, we're going to have a moderated discussion about what it takes to consider objects and consider space in terms of putting exhibitions together. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, I'll be reading, and if you have any questions from the audience, please put them into the chat, and then I can read them, feed them over to Jean and Colleen to answer. So again, as I'm talking, if you've got questions for our speakers, please put them in the chat so that we can review and send them off and get them answered at the end. So one of the things, as you were talking, that I noticed you were saying was that there was this idea of both collective, but also individuality, and also collective, but also idiosyncratic. And so in choosing your objects and considering your objects, how did working within those two realms influence how you were able to choose objects for this exhibition?
Colleen, do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Okay, and then you can add in. That's a great question. And I think it points out one of the struggles of the curatorial process is that you're often dealing with ironies within a time. And so, I mean, fashion itself is an irony, isn't it? That we want to be individual but collective. That's kind of the constant condition of it. And so as we were looking for objects, I mean, there were really so many that we could have selected, but we were trying to choose things that we thought might resonate with potential visitors. So we were looking for that familiarity, but also looking to expand our own ideas of what the 80s meant to us. Certainly, I went into it with a mindset of what the 80s were. Colleen, from a generation behind me, looking at it from a different mindset. So trying to be open to other ideas of what that look is.
I think for myself, like Jean said, I was a baby in the 80s. So I didn't live through the 80s. So my sort of impression of what 80s fashion and design is definitely, mediated by movies and popular culture. And that's sort of my impression. And that's sort of that collective understanding of like, this is what the 80s should be. And it was really fun and interesting to kind of learn that there's a lot more to the 1980s than what we realize and what I, have sort of been told and through pop culture, how many different sort of styles and things that were going on that really influenced design in the 1980s. And you can see the influence of it, from the 70s moving into the 80s, and then at the end moving into what we consider 90s fashion, and sort of really being able to explore those nuances of here's what I've been told the 80s is, and here's what our collection is saying that the 1980s is.
And, a number of those objects didn't necessarily, as huge and enormous as the Goldstein collection is, there are still objects that you brought in from other institutions or other parts of the campus. Could you tell us a little bit about what your decision process was with that?
Yes, so we pulled a lot of photographs in from the University Archives as well as from Minnesota Historical Society, because we wanted to be able to add additional imagery to show different looks and also to show the full body, because when we're showing garments on the mannequin, you don't have the hair, you don't have the accessories, you don't have the shoes, all of those elements that would go into really creating the look of someone. So by providing photographs, we were able to sort of contextualize with the entire body of what else would have gone with it. Some really fun ones that we didn't have time to show in this presentation were some images of different bands and music groups that played at First Avenue during the 1980s, which were pulled from the First Avenue archives, which we thought was really kind of fun to include that sort of Minnesota connection. We also had some pieces that discussed the AIDS crisis in the 80s that were from the university archives. They were posters discussing the AIDS crisis and also sort of showing graphic design elements from the 1980s, because we wanted to make sure to include those design disciplines as well. Jean, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you did a great job with that, Colleen. That's good.
Well, and just to clarify, Colleen, what you're saying is those posters and things are actually in the exhibit. Just didn't have a moment to show them here, but I just wanted to emphasize that the exhibition is up until through May. So if you are local to the Twin Cities, that you should come see those elements as well. So let me see. So what was, again, kind of coming from maybe that viewpoint that you do represent two different generations' experience with the 80s, is what was most interesting to each of you about this exhibition?
Full disclosure, Caren was a graduate student working with me while this exhibition was in its early stages. And there were so many different ways that we had talked about it kind of going. And I think what's interesting to me is how varied it is and how constantly difficult it is to, you say something like, well, let's do an exhibition on the 80s, but it's actually really difficult to kind of put your arms around what that means and how to create a somewhat unified narrative and thesis, more or less, of what you're going to do. So I loved going through the pieces and constantly challenging kind of myself to think about, does this really work together? Is there any common thread here? To me, that process is interesting, that it's every time it's kind of surprisingly challenging.
I would say for me, I already sort of alluded to this, of like sort of breaking down what my preconceived notions were of 1980s design. But also what I found most interesting, as this is the first time I was doing an exhibition, was just the amount of work that actually goes into what you see in a gallery. The amount of work that goes into writing like a 2-sentence label could be several hours of research and writing and revision, which, I had a kind of idea is what happened, but actually doing it is another matter. So learning that whole process of how do we take this big idea of the 1980s and really distill it down into some sort of themes that are something that we can tell a story about within an exhibition, and then how do we actually tell that story? That part was probably the most interesting to me, as well as just how many fabulous garments there are from the 1980s in our collection, and like how do we pick them? How do we decide which ones? And I feel like every day I go into the gallery or I go into the storage and I'm looking at something else and I see something and it's from the 80s and I go, oh, why didn't we use this? There's always so much more fabulous stuff to share that we just don't have the time or space to do.
And to that notion, I do want to invite the attendees or people listening to this video at a later date, that if you go to the Goldstein Museum's website, which I will post or Colleen will post later, you can virtually see the collections. And so you can type in 1980s into the search term and you can see all of those objects that maybe didn't get a chance to be in this exhibition because of restriction of just how much space the exhibition has. But that you also, those of us in the public can see that collection and maybe in our own heads put together what we might have put into an exhibition in the 1980s. As Jean said, I was on the very, very early stages of this, but this is also how long exhibitions take. They can take years to come to fruition. So what, let me see here, just given our time. Were there, so knowing that you have as much as you do about the 1980s in as far as your objects go and the archives and so forth, are there gaps that you noticed in the exhibition after the fact that you would, if you could go back and do it again, you would want to do?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we had really wanted to explore the hip hop scene in greater detail, and we don't have those objects. I purchased a 1980s era tracksuit for the exhibition, or the Goldstein did, as well as a Kangol hat and tennis shoes. And, you know, those are things that are part of kind of the bubble that we're in, that we're not getting those kinds of objects. I would say in general, it's hard to get a street style, or what do I want to say, like less premier people tend to give us things that they've saved or that have a strong association with a designer label. And so kind of exploring that side of it becomes difficult. But I think what's even more notable is the lack. We really wanted to make this a multidisciplinary show, but in terms of product design and furnishings, we just don't have those pieces. So while Memphis Group was a really prominent kind of challenge to modern design, and we don't have anything that's directly from them. And so trying to go back in and tell that very complicated story with minimal objects to support it was also really difficult.
Colleen, I didn't know if you wanted to add to that or.
No, I was thinking, I would say some gaps also in terms of, you know, we always struggle with sizing and with mannequins. So gaps in terms of being able to really show, you know, some of our garments are larger sizes and mannequins are not larger sizes, or we just don't have them because they're very expensive to get. And so, you know, there are some items that maybe we wish we could have shown, but we didn't have either the mannequins or the space to do that. And that's just, you know, an unfortunate reality of working in museums.
So a question that just came through, and even though I said I would hold questions to the end, this one fits in really well. So thank you, Cynthia, for your question about disco era. So following Cynthia's question about, well, what about the disco era? Taking that to talk a little bit more about how did you put a beginning and an end point on this so-called decade?
You know, you may or may not know that Caren and I actually curated an exhibition called Dior de Disco, Fashion in the Era of Second Wave Feminism a couple of years ago in 2019. And you know, in a way, the 80s is a logical follower of that we're kind of continuing on the chronological path here. And I think disco certainly, you know, pushed up against that. And we really were, as much as there's, idiosyncrasies within our exhibition, we obviously were not comprehensive in our covering of the time. And so I didn't feel like I had a strict bookend on dates. I will say Colleen was much more driven to but it's not from the 80s. And so I mean, that's how when you're working with somebody too, I mean, you both had different ideas about what that will mean. We do have some pieces from the 70s and 90s, but generally show things kind of that situate themselves within 1980 to 89. That being said, what was ultimately selected was highly driven by they had to be driven by our themes. Otherwise, there was no way to kind of wrap our arms around what we had. And so I guess, it was both, those themes become both exclusive and inclusive, depending on how you're looking at it.
So, and just to reiterate what those themes were, I think I got all four of them. The first was retrofuturism, deconstructing design, irreverence to the max, and I personally love the to the max element of that. It's just the Ballad Girl world that I grew up in the early 80s. And then Heritage Rebooted, again, just to restate what those were. Were there any themes that you can recall that you had to toss out?
Yes, definitely. We had probably more, I want to say like themes that maybe were more apparent early on. Like we had women's power dressing was like an early theme that we had, and we had an early theme of nostalgia, and it nostalgia ended up basically running through the entire exhibition. So that theme, instead of becoming its own separate, kind of moved into Heritage Rebooted and then became an overarching theme of the entire exhibition. And then women's like sort of power dressing and power suiting was addressed through areas like deconstructing design, as opposed to sort of breaking it off and separating it. I think, Jean, did we also have maybe like a separate section on just Japanese designers early on? And then that got moved into sort of heritage and irreverence.
Well, I think we were very conscious of not having separate cultural sections, that it was important for us not to have Japanese designers or hip hop. I mean, we really wanted to integrate all of that within the themes of the exhibition versus calling it out as separate. And that was a very intentional decision on our part. And even that term nostalgia, I know, is kind of tricky right now. And I think we felt like, commonly across themes, as Colleen was saying, that there was enough about, ideas of late capitalism, of late pluralism, of all of those terms that come around in the late 20th century that drive economy and drive kind of cultural identities, that allowed that to kind of populate the themes we ended up with. That being said, they were kind of complicated themes, and Colleen and I went back and forth constantly on trying to figure out basically how accessible they were and if we even understood them ourselves. So, I mean, it was a go around about, what is retrofusion? Deconstruction is a really complicated concept. And, so is the term postmodernism. I mean, you almost hate to bring it up. So trying to, stay with some of those themes, but make them relatable.
I think also we had so many things that could have fit in so many different sort of areas, and it was trying to decide how, how does this one object fit best into this sort of story? Because so many of our objects did tell stories about deconstructing design and irreverence and heritage and nostalgia. Like those themes were evident in pretty much everything we did. So it was, we'd have days where we'd go back and forth saying, this one fits better here. No, it fits better here. Like, how are we going to tell this story? How does it work best within the overarching sort of setup of the exhibition? And it was definitely really difficult. There was many days of pulling way too many garments and trying to filter it all down.
Well, and I will say, when Caren and I first started on this exhibition road, this was years ago, I think it was pre-COVID. At one time, we had thought about structuring the exhibition as an object alongside a historic object that it visually referenced. So sticking constantly with a theme of past informing present. But I guess we ultimately didn't know if we'd be able to, if that was an interesting enough theme to carry the times. And then you think about too, how can I make this narrative more complex than this looks like this and this looks like this. So trying to develop that part of it as well.
And I do want to remind our audience members, please, if you have questions, to put them into the chat. We're going to slide over into audience questions in just a moment or two. I do have another question though for our curators about what was, I have a few questions actually, I'm just narrowing them down. I think you've talked about the juggling of objects in terms of pulling objects out of storage and bringing them in and figuring them out, sending them back to storage, finding new ones. Is there anything that really surprised you, either in the objects or in the process? And Colleen, as a first-time curator, was there, I'm going to really put you on the spot and say, was there things that really surprised you?
I mean, I said this earlier, but it's not as simple as picking out things that look good together and putting them up in a gallery. Like, there's so much more work that goes into curating an exhibition than I think people realize or give credit to. So the amount of hours that Jean and I spent pulling objects and looking at them, just to even simplify down to maybe 3 in a grouping, had hours of work behind it. Or just writing 250 words about an object, the amount of research and time that goes into that was really surprising, but also really rewarding, because I feel like despite the fact that as an audience member, as you look at it, you only get to read those 250 words, I have built, hours of research behind it that I can take away and use somewhere else in my future career or in another exhibition or in other research. So being able to really kind of dig in and build a depth of knowledge about one certain topic area when you're making the exhibition was something that was really exciting, but also kind of surprising to me.
Jean?
Yeah, I think, I think part of what surprises me is I certainly had a lot of ideas of things that I definitely wanted to include, and most of those didn't end up in the exhibition. You just, it never quite turns out how you think it will, which is good. And it's always interesting to collaborate with a graduate student as well, who's maybe had 1 or 2 curatorial experiences, but not with this collection. And so for me, this has been true with so many of my co-curatorial experiences, that people choose things I would never think to select, or they don't like things that really resonate, with me, or I'm like, oh, that to me is a slam dunk, So I think that's interesting and a great part of collaborating on an exhibition. I mean, that's what makes it, that's what leads to kind of surprising narratives and interesting comparisons.
Like, for example, there are 2 quilts in the exhibition, which you can blame on me because I am a quilt maker, and they were exciting to me and they worked with our themes. And I think if, Caren, had you still been curating it or somebody else, there might not have even been a single quilt in the exhibition. Who knows how that would have ended up. So it's interesting to see sort of how the objects ended up because of who was doing the curation, and also like what we didn't include at the last second. We had several objects that were supposed to go in, and at the last minute, we couldn't fit them in. They didn't work with the story, they didn't work with our space. And so I remember coming in one day and Jean had been down working in it, and she goes, by the way, like, those shoes got cut, we couldn't fit them in. I was like, oh, okay, that's a bummer, but I understand. So things were changing even up to the last minute as to what was happening in the exhibition.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that real insider look into how exhibitions are constructed, because we as the visitors, we see the final product, and it is, I don't think you don't realize, or you don't know, because you don't get to have, most people don't get to be curators and don't get to have the experience of all of that happens before the day of opening, or even sometimes on the day of opening, depending on what time opening is. So thanks so much for that. So I'm following the chat here, and I do see a new question that we have from Samuel. One second, let me just read it. Have you seen any evidence of fashion responding to the new portable music technology of the 1980s? So for reference, I grew up in the 2000s and remember a lot of bags and coats with MP3 player pockets.
That's the great question. Yes, I mean, obviously now in athletic wear, you see, mini pockets kind of in the back of a pair of leggings, or, something like that, that certainly is for that purpose. I think in the 80s, too bad we didn't have a fanny pack on display, Colleen, because I do think that there were a lot of large pocket garments in the 80s. But I don't know that I have anything specific to support the concept that there were pockets specifically for mobile music. But yes, I think now there are. I think there's so many times hidden pockets or areas for, it used to be for a headphone cord to come through, which of course now is not as necessary. So I think that's always evolving. Colleen, what have you seen? You've done a lot of tech design.
I mean, yeah, I've developed, when I used to work in the fashion industry, specific garments that had like even cords running through the hoodie and things like that. But I don't know if that was necessarily something that was happening until we got to sort of like the iPhone or MP3 player stage. I also think, yes, we had the Walkman in the 1980s, but we still also had the boombox that you carried on your shoulder. And so, you carried that. So it was more about the rest of your garment going along with the look of the boombox, as opposed to having a place to fit that object, within your own garment.
So question from Martha. Does your exhibit reflect primarily an urban environment or a rural environment?
Colleen, do you want me to? I'm happy to answer, but I don't want to hog the.
It's fine. Go ahead, Jean.
I imagine that's such a great question. I've always kind of liked the idea of looking at rural fashion, but don't know how that divide really operates in kind of the post-war world where there's so much media crossover. Now, obviously, people who live on the coasts feel they have a much greater, finger on the pulse of fashion than those of us in the Midwest. So, I guess that's a more global sense of urban and rural, right? But in terms of the Minneapolis, Minnesota region, it probably is highly reflective of an urban environment. However, I would say that a lot of those same styles would have been worn in small towns across the board. Although, gosh, I just hate to say anything too definitive, because I am sure that there are nuances worthy of study in those differences. Colleen, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. Thanks, Mom. Great question. I also think it's highly, reflective of Minnesota, because a lot of our donors are Minnesota based, and so it's going to reflect, what they were wearing at the time in the 80s for Minnesota. Something I was always thinking about in the beginning of this was like, where are the crazy sweatshirts and where are the leg warmers and those sorts of things? And, those are just things that we don't have in our collection because people maybe don't save them, or they wear them to pieces, or they're things that people don't often think of donating to a collection. So, some of what you see in a museum exhibition is really reflective of the donors, of who is donating. So that's why we don't have a lot of streetwear that might reflect more, more cultural differences, because we just don't have donors who are providing those objects to the museum. So that's also maybe why we don't have rural things, because we don't have donors who are donating objects that would reflect what was worn in rural lifestyles in the 1980s.
Well, and Colleen, I think too, I mean, rural dress, there's quite a difference between kind of early 20th century rural dress and late 20th century rural dress. There's probably a greater divide. Although I'm not sure, right now, for example, we have FFA students on campus, and it's so interesting. A lot of them from rural communities come in and they're wearing skirts and pumps with their FFA jackets. And I'm sure in a way, for them, you dress up to go to the city, whereas, everybody here is lying around in sweats and a sweatshirt. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to study.
Just that result of coming out of the pandemic. We all just
haven't
quite switched back over yet. There was an earlier question while I read this new question. The earlier question was about whether the exhibition would be available online in any way. If you wouldn't mind answering that while I read the next question.
So we do have a little, we do have a little bit of online. There are some videos on our YouTube channel of actually Jean and I doing exhibition curation. It's like a time lapse of, I don't know, maybe like 6 hours of work condensed into 3 minutes, which shows some behind the scenes stuff. And then we do have a video that is like a quick walkthrough of the exhibition on our YouTube channel. It is not like a virtual tour where you can see every object individually, but it does kind of give you a nice overview of the exhibition as well. And then if you follow us on social media, we're frequently posting objects from the exhibition so that we can, encourage more people to come, or to also share with people who aren't in the Twin Cities some of those objects. So if you do that, follow us on social media, you'll be able to see them. But we don't have like a full on virtual walkthrough of it at this time.
So I just want to read Jean Matlock's comment per our earlier conversation, and then I'll get to Cynthia's question in just a moment. Jean writes that working in Detroit Lakes in the 1980s, we often laughed at our colleagues from the Twin Cities coming to meetings in very casual clothes that they thought fit the rural area, as we wore suits to the office. Just that trying to understand, I think, what city, what's rural, and what do people consider themselves when they live in it, in those physical places. So Cynthia writes, when was spandex fabric developed and created? Created an exercise wear, and then when did spandex fabric go mainstream and not just for exercise? Sort of, when did that happen?
Well, spandex is, really it started to be, Colleen, do you know the production date? Probably the 70s, 60s, 70s. I mean, it's an offshoot of nylon, which was created during World War II by DuPont. And I think, by the time we really started to see spandex and things, it was probably the 80s. I don't think I remember buying a pair of denim jeans that blended it with cotton until the 90s, or maybe even I don't know, not until a little bit later.
Yeah.
So it took a long time. I mean, of course, now, for a time anyways, leggings had kind of overtaken, at least on college campuses, jeans for women. I mean, men were wearing leggings, but it was really so much a part of what we wear. And of course, it continues to be so now. That transition, but it certainly existed in the 80s and was part of some of those, stretch mini skirts and garments. Colleen, I know you have some textile expertise as well.
Yeah, I would agree. In the 80s is when we also see sort of this move to more form-fitting silhouettes that showed off the body, which you needed spandex in order to make those garments comfortable and wearable. And I think that's why you start to see sort of that increase in those really tight form-fitting styles, is because we do have spandex that makes a garment that makes that possible. But then you go in the 90s and things get oversized and sort of really change. But now it's ubiquitous and we can't live without it. It's in pretty much everything everybody's wearing these days to make clothing more comfortable. So it's, some ways you could say that all the leggings that we wear now is just sort of a revival of what was going on in the 80s and bringing back some of that styling.
And Cynthia writes that it coincided with the movie Flashdance, definitely. And that goes back, Colleen, to you mentioning leg warmers, which I actually had forgotten about, and thanks for that memory of leg warmers in the 80s. So we have time for maybe one or two more questions, if there are one or two more questions. If not, I have a final question. Let me just give our audience a few seconds here. Some typing going on, I think. So the question I have is bringing us, oh, thank you, Diane. Lycra spandex was invented in 1958. So the question I have, just to wrap this up, is to actually bring us to the present. Where are you seeing 80s fashion now?
A lot of places. I mean, we've all seen, revivals of things like more acid wash jeans, a larger fitting jeans. I call a lot of it the Billie Eilish effect, that kind of oversized big look that comes out of the 80s. But there's also, I don't think it's duplicative of the 80s. I don't see, for example, if you look at something like big hair, I'm not seeing quite that level of volume returning. In terms of other objects, though, if you think of product design today and how specialized it's become, I do think the 80s really kicked off a pretty significant, experience economy that, of course, had been growing throughout the 20th century. It wasn't new in the 80s, but it continues to ratchet up. And I do think part of that individualism of portable technologies and those kinds of things have really made products highly individual, and including things like batch production, mass production, where you can produce smaller runs of things really efficiently and cost effectively. We just see a world awash in product type, which I think is really, the 80s really could not fend off the consumerism that technology was making available.
And I think going along with that, sort of the rise of designer labels comes out of the 1980s, and that sort of buying into a lifestyle brand, which has continued, and it comes and goes a little bit in fashion, especially in the 2000s, but is still, very prevalent of what brand are you wearing, what brand are you buying into in terms of some sort of lifestyle really comes out. But it is kind of, I find very funny that, some of the students that we teach at the U are going to vintage stores and buying vintage 80s garments and wearing them around and mixing and matching with current stuff, or, mixing and matching with things from the 90s. So we definitely see it, on our students, which is very entertaining sometimes when we, we're like, well, wait a minute, where did you get that? That you should be down in our 80s exhibition. Things like that, that we see it, but it's that sort of, what I see on the students is, again, that sort of collective memory of what we think the 80s is supposed to be, kind of, there's TV shows, Jean mentioned earlier, like Stranger Things, or the Goldbergs, that sort of has brought back this is the idea of the 80s. And a lot of those things from, for example, the Goldbergs, none of that stuff is in our exhibition. We don't have really anything that none of those terrible sweatshirts that the mom wears. We don't have any of that kind of stuff down in the exhibition, because we were trying to find and explore other varieties of 80s design and not just continue to kind of reinforce that, this is the 1980s sort of mantra.
And I did want to point out on the chat that Valeria has also suggested that the proliferation and popularization of vintage clothing has certainly contributed to this resurgence, which is what both of you mentioned, in that certainly Instagram has helped spread that in a way. So I think at this point, I'm gonna turn it back over to Jean, as we are closing up, getting very close to 12:30 Central Time.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody very much for taking time out of your day for the conversation. I also really want to extend a thank to Colleen and Caren for being here for this discussion. I've been very lucky to work with both of them in the Goldstein, and I'm glad that they were able to circle back and help up with this discussion today. So thanks to everybody. Please come see the exhibition if you have time. It's in McNeil Hall. It's free to the public and will be up through the end of May. And have a good day.
Thank you.